The sea did not know it was about to witness a tragedy. It rolled in soft and silver beneath a sky bruised gold with the last hour of afternoon, waves folding onto the shore in slow, indifferent rhythm, as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong on a day this beautiful. Rows of white chairs stretched across the cliffside grounds, each one filled with pack members dressed in their finest, silks the color of moonlight, furs draped over broad shoulders even in the warmth, the old traditions of the wolf packs refusing to bow to comfort. Garlands of sea lavender and white orchids wound around wooden arches that framed the aisle, and beyond them the ocean stretched endless and glittering, as though even nature had been summoned to bear witness. At the center of it all stood Alpha King Damian. He was a mountain of a man dressed in black and silver, the crest of his bloodline stitched into the collar of his coat, and yet for all his size, all the terrible power that pulsed beneath his skin, he stood there today, looking almost boyish, restless. His jaw was tight not from anger, but from anticipation, his hands clasped behind his back to keep them from trembling, and every few seconds his eyes flicked toward the top of the staircase that curved down from the manor house behind the grounds, the staircase his bride would descend any moment now. Julia. He had waited 300 years, by pack reckoning, for a mate who did not simply complete his wolf, but understood the man beneath it. He had burned villages in his youth and buried brothers in his prime, and none of it, had softened him the way one human girl's laughter had the first night he met her. Today, he thought, watching the doors at the top of the stairs, today all of that ends and something new begins. Beside him, his beta Marcus shifted on his feet, grinning. Never thought I'd see the day. The blood alpha of the western coast looked like he might faint from nerves. Say that again, Damian murmured, and I'll have you guarding the northern border for the next century. Marcus only laughed, low and warm, and the crowd around them rustled with quiet anticipation as the string quartet near the arch lifted their bows, ready for the first note of the processional. Then the doors at the top of the staircase opened. But it was not Julia who appeared. It was Zoe. She was the chief bridesmaid, Julia's oldest friend, the girl who had braided flowers into Julia's hair since they were children too small to understand what alphas or mates or destinies even meant. She should have been descending calmly, gracefully, a half step ahead of the bride as tradition demanded. Instead, she came stumbling through the doorway with her skirts fisted in both hands, her carefully pinned hair already falling loose around her face, and she ran. She ran down those stairs like something behind her was on fire. The quartet's bows froze mid-air. The murmuring crowd went still, then rose into a low wave of confusion as 300 pairs of eyes turned from the arch to the staircase, watching the bridesmaid nearly pitch forward down the final steps, catching herself on the railing, her chest heaving, her face bone-white beneath rouge that had been perfect an hour ago. "Zoe wee?" Damian's voice cut across the grounds like a blade, low and dangerous, every ounce of the boyish nervousness gone in an instant, replaced by something far older and colder. She reached the bottom of the stairs and could barely stand upright. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, and when the words finally came, they came broken, shredded by panic. "It's Julia!" she gasped, one hand pressed hard against her ribs as though she might be sick. "Something's wrong. She won't wake up properly. Her lips are, Alpha, please, she's dying." The word landed on the wedding grounds like a stone dropped into still water. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Not the guests, not the quartet, not even the wind off the sea. And then Damian moved for all of them. He did not run like a man. He ran like a wolf wearing a man's shape, the change rippling just beneath his skin as raw instinct tore through 300 years of careful control, and the crowd scrambled out of his path as he crossed the wedding grounds in strides too long, too fast, too inhuman to belong to anyone merely mortal. He hit the staircase and took it 2-3 steps at a time, Marcus and a dozen warriors pouring after him, the music forgotten, the flowers forgotten, every polite fiction of the ceremony collapsing behind him like a tent with its center pole ripped out. He burst through the doors of the bridal dressing room, and the world tilted sideways. Julia lay crumpled on the floor, in a pool of white silk, her wedding gown pooled around her like spilled cream, one hand still tangled in the folds of a veil she had never gotten to wear down the aisle. Her lips he had kissed 1,000 times, lips that had promised him forever just last night, had gone a sickly shade of blue-gray, and a thin froth of foam gathered at their corners. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, stuttering breaths, each one further apart than the last, as though her body were slowly, methodically forgetting how to live. Julia. Her name tore out of him raw and unrecognizable. Nothing of the king left in it, only the man. He was on his knees beside her, before he even registered moving, gathering her into his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, and beneath the perfume and the orchids and the salt air drifting through the open window, he caught it, faint, bitter, wrong. A smell that did not belong on his bride's skin, a smell he recognized from old wars, from poisoned wells and murdered rivals. Wolfsbane. Someone had poisoned his bride. Medic. His roar shattered every window in the room, rattled the mirrors, sent birds scattering off the cliffside below. "Get the healers now. She's dying. Now." And outside, 300 wedding guests stood frozen among white chairs and sea lavender, staring up at the manor house as chaos poured out of its windows, and none of them, not one, noticed that Zoe had not followed the warriors up the stairs. She stood alone at the bottom, hands still shaking, eyes fixed on the doorway above. But it was not grief on her face. It was something closer to relief.
A small favor that means everything. If you're enjoying these stories, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to me. Right now, I can't monetize this channel because I haven't reached the required number of subscribers. Your subscription brings me one step closer to keeping these stories coming and creating even better content for you. Thank you for watching, supporting, and being part of this journey. Please subscribe, like, and share. You can truly make a difference.
Chapter 2. Damian did not hand his bride to the healers. He carried her himself, through corridors that emptied ahead of him as servants and warriors alike pressed themselves flat against the walls, none of them daring to speak, none of them daring to even breathe too loudly. Julia's head lolled against his chest, her wedding veil trailing behind them like a dying thing, and beneath his ribs, his wolf was clawing at the walls of his control, howling a single unbroken note of grief and fury that only he could hear. He had faced down rival alphas without flinching. He had walked into ambushes with a smile. Nothing had ever made his hands shake the way they shook now, cradling 130 pounds of the only thing he had ever truly wanted to keep. The healing chambers exploded into motion the second he kicked the doors open. Old Marin, the pack's head healer, took one look at Julia's blue-grey lips and did not waste a single second on ceremony. Table. Now. Someone get me silver water and crushed moon thistle. Now, damn you, move. Bodies scattered in every direction as Damian laid Julia down with a gentleness that seemed almost violent in its contrast to the terror on his face. And Marin's hands flew over her patient, pressing fingers to her throat, peeling back an eyelid, bringing her nose close to Julia's parted lips to breathe in the scent still clinging to her skin. Marin went rigid. "Wolfsbane," she whispered, "bonded with something else. Something I don't—" She looked up at Damian, and for the first time in the 30 years he had known her, he saw real fear in the old healer's eyes. "This isn't a hunter's poison, Alpha. This has been engineered. Wolfsbane alone would have killed a human girl in minutes. Whoever made this wanted her to suffer first. Wanted time. Then buy her more of it," Damian snarled, low and absolute, the kind of order that left no room for anything but obedience. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care what it costs me. You keep her breathing, or I will tear this healing house down with my own hands and rebuild it out of whoever failed her." Marin did not flinch at the threat. She had heard worse from him during wars, but she nodded once, sharply, and turned back to her patient with new urgency. What followed was a blur of silver needles and bitter-smelling poultices, of Julia's body arching against invisible pain, of Damian gripping her hand so tightly that healers twice warned him he might break her fingers, and he did not loosen his grip even once. When Marin announced that the poison had reached too deep for herbs alone, that only a blood bond transfer might slow its progress, a process that would burn through Damian's own strength, like fuel thrown on a fire, he did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. He bared his wrist to the blade himself. "Take it," he said. "Take whatever she needs." Somewhere in the fevered space between life and death, Julia dreamed. She was 8 years old again, sitting cross-legged in a meadow of wild clover, with a girl who had scraped knees and a gap-toothed grin, the two of them weaving crowns out of daisies, while their mothers gossiped nearby in the shade. "Best friends forever," young Zoe had declared, pressing a clumsy daisy crown onto Julia's head like a coronation. "No matter what. Even if you become some fancy alpha's wife one day and forget all about me, I'd never forget you," young Julia had said, and meant it with her whole small heart. The dream shifted, blurred, aged forward. 16 years old now, and Zoe's smile had grown sharper at the edges, in ways Julia, even now, in the depths of poisoned sleep, could not quite explain. There had been a boy once, a summer festival, a dance that Zoe had wanted, and Julia had been offered instead, and Zoe's congratulations afterward had come a half-second too late, her hug a half-second too tight. There had been small things like that scattered through the years, a compliment that landed like a blade, a silence held a moment too long, threads Julia had never once thought to pull, because best friends did not lie to each other. Best friends did not smile at your wedding while poison worked through your blood. The dream did not answer whether that was still true. Julia's eyes opened for the first time in 11 hours, glassy and unfocused, finding Damian's face hovering above her like the only fixed point in a spinning world. He had not left her side once, not to eat, not to change out of his ruined wedding clothes, not even to accept the reports his warriors tried to bring him about the search for whoever had done this. His hand found hers instantly, gripping it like a man holding onto a rope over a cliff. "You're awake," he breathed, and something in his iron composure cracked audibly. "Stay awake, Julia. Stay with me." Her lips trembled, cracked and colorless, forming words that took 3 tries to escape. Damian, just his name at first, small and afraid. Then, gathering strength she did not have to spare, "If I don't, if this, don't." His voice broke on the single syllable. "Don't you dare say it. Listen to me." Her fingers tightened weakly around his, urgency burning through the fog of poison in her veins. "If I don't make it, promise me you won't be alone. Promise me you'll let someone love you the way I did." Her eyes found Zoe, hovering pale and trembling at the foot of the bed, hands pressed to her mouth, as though holding back a sob. "Marry Zoe. She loves this pack. She loves," a wet, painful cough, "she loves you both. Promise me, Damian." The room went utterly silent. Zoe's reaction came instantly, beautifully, exactly as rehearsed, as if she had practiced it in a mirror for years without ever admitting to herself that she had. "No, Julia, don't say that. Don't you dare say that," she sobbed, sinking to her knees beside the bed, burying her face against the blanket, her shoulders shaking with what looked, to every single person in that room, like the purest grief a friend could offer. "You're going to live. You're going to fight this. I won't hear another word of it." But beneath the shelter of her own hair, hidden from every eye but her own, Zoe's mouth curved, just faintly, just for a fraction of a second, into something far too close to a smile. Damian, drowning in the terror of nearly losing everything, did not see it. He only heard a dying woman's request and a grieving best friend's refusal to accept it, and he had no reason, not yet, to wonder which of the 2 women in that room was telling him the truth. Chapter 3. Julia's fever broke on the 3rd night, her breathing evening out into something steady enough that Marin finally allowed herself to sleep for more than an hour at a stretch. Damian did not share in that relief. He sat at his bride's bedside, watching the rise and fall of her chest, and with every hour that passed without her waking fully, something in him hardened into cold, methodical purpose. Grief was a luxury for men who had the freedom to fall apart. He did not. Someone had poisoned the woman he loved on the one day she should have been safest, surrounded by his entire pack, and he intended to find them if he had to burn down every alliance and every friendship in his territory to do it. He summoned Marcus before dawn. "I want every person who touched her food, her wine, her dress, or her skin in the 72 hours before that wedding," he said, voice flat and merciless in the candlelight. "I want the guest list cross-checked against every enemy I have ever made, and I want to know who benefits if Julia dies. Start there. Motive first. Opportunity will follow." The investigation moved fast and ugly. Kitchen staff were questioned until they wept, terrified of a punishment they had no part in earning. The seamstress who fitted Julia's gown was interrogated for 6 hours before Marcus grudgingly admitted her hands had shaken too honestly, her confusion too raw, to be anything but innocent. Rival packs were the obvious suspects. The Thornwood pack to the north had never forgiven Damian for the border war 2 winters past, and the Ashgale Alpha had made no secret of his fury when Damian refused a marriage alliance with his daughter. Warriors were dispatched to quietly investigate both, and for 2 full days, Damian allowed himself to believe the answer lay somewhere far from home, in some cold, familiar war between packs. It was easier that way. It hurt less. Even Julia's own family came under a suspicious eye. However briefly, old wolf law dictated that any dowry dispute or inheritance quarrel could turn kin into killers, and Julia's uncle had grumbled for years about being passed over for packland. But the man wept so openly at his niece's bedside, so genuinely undone by the sight of her poisoned and pale, that Damian struck him from the list within the hour, disgusted with himself for ever writing his name down at all. It was Marcus, 3 days into the investigation, who first said the name none of them wanted to consider. Alpha, he said it carefully, the way a man tests ice before trusting his full weight to it. "I keep circling back to something. The poison. Wolfsbane bonded with something unidentifiable," Marin said. "Engineered. That's not Hunter's work, and it's not a rival pack's work either. Every pack I know uses Wolfsbane raw, crude, fast. This was patient. Someone wanted her to suffer on a timeline. Someone who knew the ceremony schedule down to the minute. Someone who had access to her the entire morning of the wedding, alone, with no one watching." Damian's jaw tightened. "Say the name, Marcus." "Zoe Wee was the last person with her before the ceremony," Marcus said quietly. "She was the one who did Julia's hair, adjusted her veil, poured her the calming tea the healers always give brides before a binding ceremony. He let that settle before continuing. And she was the one who came running down those stairs, Alpha, before anyone else even knew something was wrong. She's Julia's oldest friend," Damian said. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded thinner than he intended, as though some part of him had already been quietly assembling the same suspicion and hating himself for it. "She's grieved at that bedside every day since. She held Julia's hand through the worst of the fever." "I know," Marcus said. "That's exactly what makes it so hard to look at directly." Damian said nothing for a long moment, staring into the fire, remembering, unbidden, the way Zoe's sobs had sounded just slightly too rehearsed the night Julia asked him to marry her instead. He had dismissed the thought the moment it surfaced, ashamed of himself for doubting a grieving woman. Now it crawled back up his spine and refused to leave. "Dig," he said finally, quietly. "If I'm wrong, no one outside this room ever hears her name attached to this. But if I'm right," his voice dropped to something low and dangerous, "I want to know everything." It took Marcus 4 more days to find it, and when he brought the report to Damian's study, he set it down on the desk like a man setting down something that might explode. "A tavern keeper on the southern trade road remembers a woman matching Zoe's description, meeting with a man 6 weeks ago," Marcus said, hooded, careful not to be seen, but the tavern keeper's daughter recognized the crest stitched into his cloak when the wind caught it. He paused. It belonged to Castor, Alpha of the Ravenswood pack, the pack whose territory borders ours to the east, the land your father fought 3 wars to keep out of Ravenswood hands. Damian went very still. Castor has wanted that land back for 20 years. And a wedding between you and Julia would have sealed a treaty that guaranteed we'd never have to give it up, Marcus said. But a dead bride, a broken alliance, a grieving Alpha too consumed by tragedy to defend his borders properly, that's an opportunity. Castor didn't need an army to take that land, Alpha. He just needed your wedding to fail. And Zoe delivered it to him, Damian said, the words tasting like poison in his own mouth. There's more. Marcus hesitated, and for the first time in years, Damian's oldest friend looked genuinely reluctant to speak. I talked to 2 of the older pack women who helped raise both girls. They both said the same thing, unprompted, before I even asked a real question. They said, Zoe has loved you since she was 16 years old. Said she never told a soul because Julia saw you first, and Zoe swore she'd rather die than come between her best friend and her happiness. He exhaled slowly. Apparently, she changed her mind about that particular oath. Damian sat back in his chair, and for the first time since the wedding grounds had dissolved into chaos, something other than fear moved through him. Something colder, something that had waited its whole life for a reason to be this dangerous. Jealousy, ambition, a bargain struck in the shadows with the one enemy who had always wanted his land more than his throne. It was almost elegant in its cruelty. Zoe got Damian, and Castor got the border, and Julia simply ceased to be an obstacle to either of them. She held her hand, Damian said quietly, almost to himself. Every single night, she wept at that bedside like her own heart was breaking. Maybe it was, Marcus said. Guilt does strange things to people. Or maybe none of it was real at all. Damian rose from his chair, and the candlelight caught something in his eyes that made even Marcus take an involuntary step back. Bring me proof I can hold in my hands, he said. Not tavern rumors, not old women's gossip. I want something Zoe cannot smile her way out of. He turned toward the window, toward the dark line of the sea beyond the cliffs, toward the wedding grounds still littered with wilted orchids no one had cleared away. Because when I confront her, I intend to watch her face the moment she understands there is no version of this where she walks away from what she's done. Chapter 4. Julia woke fully for the first time in 9 days to find sunlight instead of candlelight on her face, and Marin declaring, with the closest thing to a smile the old healer allowed herself, that the worst of the poison had finally burned itself out of her blood. She was weak as a newborn fawn, her voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes were clear, and when Damian came to her bedside that afternoon, she reached for his hand with a strength that made something in his chest unclench for the first time in over a week. He did not tell her about Zoe yet. He wanted proof in his hands first, a confession he could not doubt, before he let that particular knife anywhere near a woman still healing from poison. But proof arrived faster than he expected. A second tavern witness, a merchant who had seen coin change hands between a hooded woman and Castor's men, and finally, damningly, a servant girl who confessed under gentle questioning that Zoe had asked her, weeks before the wedding, which imported wines came from Ravenswood territory, and whether such wine could be poured without anyone noticing the label had been switched. That evening, Damian summoned Zoe to his study. She arrived composed, dressed in soft grey, her face arranged into the careful, exhausted grief she had worn like armor for over a week. "You wanted to see me, Alpha. Is it Julia? Is she—" "She's stable," Damian said, and watched her carefully as he said it. Relief, or something that only looked like it, flickered across her face. "Sit down, Zoe." She sat. He did not. "Tell me about Castor," he said. The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds, but Damian watched every one of them land on her like separate blows. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, went rigid. The color that had been carefully maintained in her cheeks for over a week of performed grief drained out all at once, leaving her the same sickly pale Julia had been the night of the wedding. "I don't—" Her voice cracked on the second word. "I don't know what you mean." "A tavern keeper's daughter remembers your cloak," Damian said, each word measured, deliberate, a blade sliding slowly into place. A merchant remembers your coin. A servant girl remembers you asking which wines came from Ravenswood, and whether a switched label would go unnoticed by a bride too excited to taste anything but her own happiness. He finally moved, leaning both hands flat on his desk, bringing his face level with hers, his eyes gone the pale, inhuman gold of his wolf, just beneath the surface. I want to hear you say it, Zoe. I want to hear the truth come out of your mouth before I decide what happens to you next. Her composure did not crumble slowly. It shattered all at once, like glass under a hammer, the mask of the grieving best friend falling away to reveal something raw and unrecognizable beneath it. Something that had clearly been screaming silently for years under the surface of every kind word and every loyal smile. You want the truth. Her laugh came out broken, jagged, nothing like the warm laughter that had charmed the pack for 2 decades. Fine, fine. I loved you first, Damian. Before Julia ever looked at you twice, before she even knew what an alpha's mate bond felt like, I had already decided you were mine. I watched you for years. I waited. I told myself if I was patient enough, kind enough, good enough, you would eventually see me the way you saw her. Tears spilled down her face, but there was no softness left in them, only fury finally given permission to exist out loud. And then Castor found me at a trade festival 2 months before your wedding, and he said the words I'd been screaming inside my own head for years. He said I deserved better than watching from the sidelines. He said if the wedding never happened, if Julia simply disappeared, the alliance between our lands would collapse, and you would need comfort, and I would be right there to give it to you. He gave me the poison. I gave Julia the wine. Her voice dropped to something almost pleading, almost childlike. I didn't want to kill her, Damian. I swear it. I only wanted her gone, just long enough, just sick enough, so that the wedding would fail and you would finally turn to me instead. The study door burst open before Damian could respond. Julia stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, Marin hovering behind her in obvious protest at a patient 9 days out from near death, dragging herself out of bed. She had heard enough, perhaps all of it, her face white with a devastation that had nothing to do with poison and everything to do with betrayal, far more personal than any blade. Zoe. Julia's voice shook, but it did not break. You held my hand every night. You cried at my bedside. You told me to fight. Her eyes filled, spilling over despite every effort to hold them back. You told me you loved me like a sister. I did love you, Zoe sobbed, and horribly, wretchedly. It might even have been true. I loved you, and I still poisoned you, because loving him hurt worse than loving you ever helped. Julia crossed the room on legs that clearly should not have been carrying her yet, and struck Zoe across the face with what little strength her recovering body could summon. It was not a warrior's blow. It did not need to be. Zoe's head snapped sideways, and when she looked back up, the last shred of her composure finally gave way entirely, dissolving into ugly, unguarded weeping. Grief now, real grief, not for what she'd done to Julia, but for the fact that it had all come apart before it ever bought her anything at all. By morning, the truth had spread through the pack like wildfire through dry grass. Warriors who had trained beside Zoe's brothers refused to look at her. Kitchen staff who had once shared gossip with her over morning bread now spat at the ground when her name was spoken. The old packwomen who had watched her grow up whispered that they had always sensed something coiled too tight beneath her smile, though none of them, to their shame, had ever said so aloud. And beyond the borders, word traveled faster and darker still, that Alpha Damian's bride had been poisoned in a plot engineered by Ravenswood's Alpha, that Castor had reached across pack lines to strike at Damian through the one wound he could never properly defend. Marcus arrived at dawn with grim news. Ravenswood scouts had been spotted testing the eastern border overnight, as though sensing that the moment of maximum weakness, a wounded bride, a betrayed Alpha, a pack still reeling from scandal, was exactly the moment to finally make his move. He's not finished, Marcus said quietly, watching Damian's face harden into something ancient and merciless. Castor thought Zoe's poison would break you quietly, from the inside. Now that it's failed, he'll try to break you the old way. Damian looked out the window toward the sea, toward the wedding grounds where wilted orchids still lay scattered across cold stone, and felt the last of his mercy burn away into something far colder and far more absolute. Then let him come, he said. He'll find out exactly what it costs to touch what's mine. Chapter 5. The entire pack gathered in the great hall at dawn, summoned by a horn that had not sounded for judgment in over a decade. Torches lined the stone walls, throwing long shadows across faces that ranged from furious to frightened, and at the center of it all, Zoe knelt in chains before the raised dais where Damian stood. The weight of ancient law settled over his shoulders like a second, heavier coat. Wolf law was old, and it was not gentle. A pack member who conspired with an enemy Alpha to poison the mate of their own Alpha King had, under any reading of the old codes, forfeited their life the moment the poison touched Julia's lips. Damian had spent the entire night alone with those codes, and every version of them ended the same way, with Zoe's blood on the stones of this very hall before the sun fully rose. "Zoe of the Western Pack," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the hall without needing to be raised, the kind of quiet that came from absolute authority rather than volume. "You stand accused of conspiring with Alpha Castor of Ravenswood to poison Julia, mate of your Alpha King, on the day of her binding ceremony. You have confessed this crime in front of witnesses. Under the law of our ancestors, the penalty for an attack on an Alpha's mate, conspired with a rival pack, is death." He let the word hang in the torchlit air, watched it land on every face in the hall, watched Zoe's shoulders curl inward, as if she could make herself small enough to disappear. "Does anyone speak in her defense?" Silence answered him. Even Zoe's own brothers, standing near the back of the hall, said nothing, their faces carved from the same stone as everyone else's grief. Then a single voice broke the silence, quieter than his, weaker, but no less certain. "I do." Julia stepped forward from where she had been seated beside the dais, still pale, still healing, leaning only slightly on Marin's arm as she crossed the stone floor to stand before her former friend. The hall shifted with murmured surprise, but Julia did not waver. "She poisoned me," Julia said, loud enough now for every ear in the hall to catch it clearly. "She betrayed 20 years of friendship for jealousy and ambition, and I will carry the scar of what she did for the rest of my life. I am not here to defend what she did." Her eyes found Zoe's, and something passed between them that was not forgiveness, but was not entirely without mercy either. "But death does not undo poison. It does not give me back the friend I thought I had, and it will not stop Castor from finding some other knife to put in some other hand. I ask my Alpha for something harder than a killing blow. I ask for banishment, stripped of pack name and pack protection, sent from these lands forever, a life without the pack she betrayed, which for a wolf is its own kind of death, slower and lonelier than any blade could offer." The hall erupted in murmurs, some outraged, some visibly relieved, and Damian looked down at the woman who had nearly died and still found room in her ruined heart for mercy sharper than most men's cruelty. He was silent for a long moment, weighing 300 years of law against the only voice in the room that had ever truly mattered to him. "Banishment," he said finally, and the word rang through the hall like a verdict carved in stone. "Zoe, you are stripped of pack name, pack protection, and pack land, effective this hour. You will leave these territories before nightfall, and you will never return. If you are found within our borders again, the law's original sentence will be carried out without mercy or delay." He looked past her, to where 2 warriors already stood ready. "Escort her to the border." Zoe did not thank Julia. She could not seem to find any words at all, weeping silently as the chains were removed only to be replaced by an escort that would walk her, unarmed and unprotected, straight out of the only home she had ever known. Castor did not wait long to discover his conspirator had failed. He arrived at Damian's eastern border 3 days later, with a war party numbering in the hundreds, banners of Ravenswood black and crimson snapping in the wind, his voice carrying across the contested land with the arrogance of a man who believed a poisoned bride and a broken pack would be too weak to properly defend itself. He had badly miscalculated. Damian met him at the border with his full war council at his back, and when Castor demanded the disputed land as though he still held some hidden leverage, Damian only smiled, the kind of smile that had made grown warriors reconsider entire wars. "You poisoned my mate," Damian said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, "and thought it would make me too broken to defend what's mine. Instead, you handed me every reason I will ever need to end you cleanly, in front of both our packs, with no one left to call it anything but justice." He rolled his shoulders, and the change rippled visibly beneath his skin, gold eyes bleeding into full amber, claws lengthening at his sides. "Choose. Single combat, alpha to alpha, or I let my entire war council loose on every soldier you brought with you today." Castor, arrogant but not stupid, chose combat, believing his own considerable strength might yet salvage something from a plan gone catastrophically wrong. The fight did not last long. Grief and fury had honed something in Damian sharper than any blade forged by mortal hands, and when it ended, Castor lay defeated in the dirt of the border he had wanted so badly, Damian's claws at his throat, the entire watching crowd of both packs utterly silent. "Your life, for your land," Damian said. "The border stays mine. Ravenswood pays tribute for the next decade for the insult done to my mate, and you will personally deliver the news to your own pack that you failed, so that everyone in your territory understands exactly what happens to those who touch what belongs to me." Castor, defeated and humiliated, had no strength left to refuse. The wedding grounds by the sea had been rebuilt within a month, every wilted orchid replaced, every white chair set in careful rows once more, the arch rebuilt with fresh garlands of sea lavender that swayed gently in the same salt wind that had carried chaos through these same grounds not so long ago. This time, Julia walked down the staircase herself, slower than she once might have, a faint scar still visible at the edge of her wrist where the healers had drawn poisoned blood away in the darkest hours of her recovery. But her eyes were clear, and her smile, when it found Damian waiting at the altar, held nothing but certainty. He met her halfway down the aisle, instead of waiting at the altar this time. Some things, he had decided, he was no longer willing to leave to chance or ceremony. "You came down those stairs on your own 2 feet, he murmured, taking her hands in his. "Do you know what that means to me?" "It means we get to finish what we started," Julia said, and her voice, though still soft from months of healing, did not waver at all. They said their vows with the sea rolling gold and endless behind them, the whole pack watching in reverent silence, and when Damian finally kissed his bride, his wife, his mate, alive and whole and choosing him again with full knowledge of everything that had nearly taken her from him, the sound that rose from the gathered pack was not the polite applause of the first attempted wedding, but something wilder, more relieved, closer to a howl of triumph than any human cheer. Scarred, both of them, in ways that would never fully fade, but unbreakable now, in a way that no poison, no jealousy, and no rival alpha's ambition would ever be able to touch again.